Hello, everybody. My name is Cristina Anguiano Carrasco, and I have the pleasure to be chairing this session this afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where in the globe you are. This session is about assessing Indigenous students and co-creating a culturally relevant and sustaining assessment system. However, due to recent circumstances, we kind of shifted a little bit how we are going to talk about it. In any case, I'd like to, first of all, make a note again that this is a session organized or sponsored by the Committee on Diversity Issues in Testing. I wouldn't be remiss if I don't give a big shout out to Leanne Kerling-Geller. She was the one who organized that session originally to be done during the NCME, that, as you all know, was canceled, the in-person session. So we were able, thanks to our fantastic speakers, we were able to do this virtual panel today. And just a little note to remind you, if you have any culturally relevant, diversity relevant research that you would like to submit to NCME, just nominate your coordinated session to be the NCME Diversity Issues in Testing invited session. It will go through the same review process as any other submission, but if our committee will also review it, and if selected, it will be featured prominently on the schedule. So just an idea, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the email that you can see on your screens. So let's talk about assessing Indigenous students. As mentioned, this session will be focused on trying to answer the questions, how can I be an ally and how can I help to be fair to Indigenous students? In order to do that, we will move from a global perspective to maybe a more specific one, starting with Cheryl Sable. She's a Cree woman from Treaty 6 territory with a degree in Native Student Studies and Criminology from the University of Saskatchewan. Sherry developed her passion for Indigenous issues through personal experience and professional life. Sherry's mother and all her aunts and uncles were survivors of the residential school system. She comes from a family of 10 children who are all part of the 60s scoop. She's the first generation to raise her children without government interference. Sherry has been studying, volunteering, and working in First Nation issues over 25 years on a wide range of social, political, and legal issues like poverty, housing, child and family services, treaty rights, education and legislation impacting First Nations. Sherry continues to support a variety of educational initiatives at the Hadlon Catholic District School Board by providing professional development to all staff, introducing Indigenous elders, artists, performance, traditional knowledge keepers to schools, while encouraging teachers to embed Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. We will then move to a more education assessment focus part of the presentation, and that will be via Pohai Kukea Schultz. She's a native Hawaiian daughter, wife, and mother, and currently resides with her family in the beautiful valley of Waimalu on the island of Ohio. As a former elementary school teacher in a Hawaiian community in the west side of Ohio, her past and current work centers around commitment to colonial and to support and uplift the Hawaiian community. Dr. Kukia Schultz experiences at the University of Hawaii at Mananoa's College of Education include training teachers for Hawaiian community and Hawaiian language immersion schools, working in student services with a focus on the recruitment, retention, and graduation of Hawaiian students from the College Teacher of Education programs, and currently serving as the principal investigator of the Hawaii State Department of Education assessments of Hawaii language immersion schools for state and federal accountability. Dr. Carl Schultz's research interests focus on the potential and promise of education self-determination in assessments for Native students. And finally, we're gonna narrow it down a little bit more to focus on measurement and psychometrics approach via Dr. Carrie Egler. She has a PhD in education research from the University of Colorado and will share her experience as an ally of the Indigenous people. Dr. Egler been supporting the work of the University of Hawaii in a statewide project to build assessments for the Kauai schools, the Hawaiian language immersion schools that we mentioned before. As a psychometrician for the project, she supports the construction of assessments that prioritize the values and worldwide view of the Hawaiian language community. Simultaneously, she's supporting the project in developing technical information necessary to submit the assessment system to the United States Department of Education and the peer review process. Dr. Egler is also a consultant at the Central Regional Education Laboratory, where she leads projects for the American Indian Research Alliance. Two of her projects focus on supporting Indian education directors in developing culturally relevant needs assessment that reflect the community's priorities. This work aims to develop surveys that measure important strengths and challenges to schools serving Native students. The survey's results will allow the states to provide more focused support. So with further ado, I'm gonna pass it on to Sherry Sewell to start with the first global approach. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Like Christina said, my name is Sherry Sewell, and I come from Treaty 6 territory, which is in Saskatchewan. I reside right now in Milton, Ontario, and the traditional territory that I'm on, that I situate myself on, is the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as Six Nations of the Grand River. It's really important for me to acknowledge whose land that I'm on, here where I'm situated, because it's important to know that there were so many other nations that had lived here prior to colonization. In Canada, we have a totally different, in Canada, there's a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences, especially when we're talking about Indigenous students, Indigenous families, Indigenous people. Prior to colonization, Indigenous people had lived in Turtle Island, what we call Turtle Island, which includes what we now know as the United States, as well as Canada. There was over 50 million, if not more, Indigenous people that were on Turtle Island prior to colonization. But just over the years of contact, of warfare, of diseases, of annihilation, of murder, things like that have reduced our numbers quite significantly. In Canada, we have roughly about 1.2 million Indigenous people that are registered with Indian Affairs. Now that card that people carry is also a race-based legislation, and if you have a card, the government knows where you are. Prior to me being born, I always give my age because it gives context. So I was born in 1961. In 1960, my mother had the right to vote in Canada. Yes, women had the right to vote in Canada in 1918, but not Indigenous women, not Black women, white women. My mother had the right to vote in 1960 or 61. Or 1960, sorry, and then I was born 1961. So I'm as old as my mom had the right to vote in our country, in Canada. I've, like Christine said, I'm also the education advisor for our school board, which is Halton Catholic District School Board. And I do an awful lot of work with embedding Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum. I'm also here today to talk a little bit about worldviews and what those worldviews mean, because we are all educated in a Western system, meaning that, you know, we have certain things that we're taught, certain histories that we're taught, but always those histories always exclude people. And it's, of course, that word history is his story. And so his story, whoever is the conqueror, whoever wins that battle, it's his story that is given. I just want to take a little bit of time just to talk a small little bit about research and evaluation when it comes to Indigenous students in Canada. We have a wealth of knowledge with a lot of educators, just like you guys do down in the South, with our academics within academia. And so one of the ladies that have been doing an awful lot of research and evaluation and assessment her name is Verna Kirkness. Now she's come up with these things called the 4 R's when you are to do any sort of research within Indigenous communities. And Indigenous communities meaning here in Canada. I just want to unpack that word just a tiny bit, because we were called Indians prior to colonization. And so that word has stuck with us. But that word also has very negative pejorative context as well, and a lot of racism that goes along with that word. When we've had numerous inquiries into Canada and in Canada, from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People to the Ipperwash Inquiry to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we've always had words are very, very important. And so within the Canadian context, Aboriginal and treaty rights were protected and enshrined in our Constitution in 1985. But the word Aboriginal has 2 meanings for people, ab and original. There's that suffix there, that prefix there, that a lot of our people feel that they're the original people of Turtle Island. And so that was a Canadian, that was a term made up by the Canadian government, Aboriginal. We never considered ourselves Aboriginal. We've always considered ourselves people of the nation or people of the land. Within the word Indigenous, we've now claimed, in a sense, that word Indigenous only coming from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. Canada, as well as the United States, were the last to sign on UNDRIP for various reasons. And Australia, I believe, as well, because it's large Indigenous and Native American population, or Maori population, or Aboriginal population and Aboriginal population in Australia. So that term Indigenous is really important, that I just position myself as an Indigenous woman. That Indigenous word is a lot more, to me, it's a lot more powerful than those pejorative terms. Now, when we're looking at research in Canada, and Verna Kirkness has done an awful lot of research around there, with respect, she's got 4 R's. So respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And those are the 4 things to go into Indigenous communities with. First, you have to develop that relationship. You have to have the respect of, right, and what you're doing. You have that relevance. Why are you going in that community to do that work? Making sure that you are asking and answering those questions. And the reciprocity, what are you going to give back? This is what we're always asking, what I'm asking my teachers now in Canada to do. What's the reciprocity to give back to the community? And you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility that now you learn, you want to be an ally. These are the things that also come into play. I just want to quickly share my slide with you when it comes to worldviews. And let me just, I think I have it here up. And so when we're talking, you can see it, Christina? Just shake your head. Okay. When we're talking about worldviews, you know, like I said at the beginning, we are looking at worldviews, comparing our Indigenous worldviews to Western worldviews. Now, an awful lot of this information comes from a really awesome book and an awesome author. I'm just trying to find it. Who has, just excuse me for a minute. Sorry. This one, 21 Things You Need to Know About the Indian Act. And it comes from there. This worldviews comes from some of that. And so I use that as an example. So when we're talking about worldviews, we're talking about cultures having their own personal interpretation or your collective cultural code. And we have to understand that these are different between Aboriginal, and I used Aboriginal only in this context because I took a direct quote. That we have to understand Aboriginal and world and Eurocentric, they do clash. They clash, they have world clashes, but they also have an ability to understand philosophy. and our values and our customs. Now, when we're looking at worldviews, you know, we're also thinking in a very general term, because this also is to a university course, right? And I'm trying to give it in like 10 minutes. So with worldviews, you know, of course, you can read the slide here, but it's very, very general in these terms. When we're talking about the description of differences, that no way can we indicate that people share the same worldviews, that Indigenous worldviews are the same, just like Western worldviews. And so we can't, just like when we talk about people coming from Europe, not everybody is the same from Europe. You have your different countries, just like Indigenous people. We're not all the same. We're not you know, there's not a melting pot of Indigenous people. And so I just wanted to be clear on that one. And when we're talking about, you know, worldview, of course, here it says, you know, we have a set belief of values and a set of beliefs and values that we honor and are upheld by a number of people, the people that's in our community. And then we're starting to look at, you know, how society has a worldview. There's worldviews in every society, and how people interact and learn from one another. And it's not uncommon for other people to kind of acquire different worldviews. Now, when we see that the difference between worldviews is that they sometimes subscribe to an opposite approach to knowledge or connectedness and science. And so we see that sometimes, especially with science, that, you know, during colonization, that Indigenous people didn't have science, but yet we lived on the land and we knew we knew all sorts of things just by observation. So when it comes into direct contact or conflict with Western ways of looking at things, there was that contact, that there was conflict, that, you know, Western world is learned by, you know, you're learning by books, whereas traditional worldview, you're out doing the things with your community. Now, you know, I'm not going to read all these here. I'll just leave them up here, because I know I don't want to cut into some time that my co-presenters are doing as well. But just, you know, I just want to talk, you know, from that Indigenous worldview, that, you know, we were our worldviews were spiritually orientated, and that we had a system of belief in a spiritual world. So of course, with Christianity, that came into conflict, right? There's many truths, and truths are dependent upon individual experiences, which we know that there's many truths in even in this room that we have here, and that everything is a state of relatedness. So, you know, with the changing of the moon or the changing of the environment that we look outside, that's what we're talking about. Whereas Western worldview is so compartmentalized, and, you know, we have a relationship to our kinship, to our community, to our family. We have interconnectedness with the environment, with the stars, with the changing of the seasons, making sure that harvest or planting, those kinds of things. So those are really enforced in our communities. Now, especially with land, you know, like we're just opening up our schools, and we're having, you know, some challenges with opening up our schools because of COVID. Now, if we were all out on the land, it might be slightly different. We know that the land is sacred. It's given to us by our creator, not God, but our creator. And that time is linear. We just look at things in a cyclical pattern. And that time is measured in those events as well. Whereas in the Western worldview, you know, the land and resources are there for extract and for profit. So that's totally different from an Indigenous worldview than a Western worldview. And again, time is linear. It's just, you know, functions with the days, the months, the years, and it just reinforces that linear structure. Now, when we're talking about, you know, the relationships that we have with people, that was one of the things that the Indian agent, we had an Indian agent who was an employee of the Crown, which is the Canadian government. The Indian agent was stationed in every single community, or reserve is what they're called up here. We call them First Nations. But you know, the relationship that people had with each other, the reciprocity that was there, the respect, the relevance for the community was just so key to making sure that that relationship of the community was whole, that it was healthy, that we looked after each other. Whereas in a Western worldview, it wasn't like that. It's like everybody lives in their houses and their boxes. And, you know, sometimes I don't even know the people, and I'm just as guilty. I don't even know sometimes the people down the street who live here. So we're really moved away from the relationship that we had with our community, with the people, with our elders, our young children, things like that. And having those relationships with people in our community, and that we are not the most important people on the earth. Whereas in Western worldview, humans, you know, there's that hierarchy, if people have seen that hierarchy where the humans are on the top and then all the animals and things like that are on the bottom. So it's totally flipped on for Indigenous people, that it's the animals and everything else that we need them more than they need us. And that amassing wealth was good for the community. It wasn't an individual thing for amassing wealth for personal gain. So it's slightly different when we're talking about Indigenous and Western worldviews. And so it would become very, very different when we are looking at evaluation and assessment, when you're having these two different things that are coming up. Most of universities and colleges come from that Western mindset. But when you have an Indigenous student that is coming into the four walls or into academia, most times that student's relationship that they would have had with the community, with their family, with the environment around them, is not taken into account when they come into our schools. And even in my school, and we have students that are not being looked upon as not looked upon, sorry, that's the wrong word, that we don't honor some of our students' experiences. And you know, here's a good quote, and I think this is my last slide. You know, that we all have to live together or we perish together as fools. But it's also suggested that anywhere in society that there is a dominant view that's held by most members, and that alternative worldviews do exist, but they're usually not held by the majority of society, which is how we look at it here in Canada. We call it Indigenous Traditional Knowledge, or ITK. But that also is an anthropological term. We just look at as old stories, right? The stories that our elders and our knowledge holders have had since time immemorial, that we were placed here, we were never discovered. We were placed here. We never came across the land bridge from Alaska, from Russia, Siberia, through Alaska, and then, populated the Americas. All of our stories and all of our elders have told us that we've been placed here by Creator. And so when we're placed by Creator, and this is your place in space, this is where it becomes, and of course we have colonization and things like that that really play into it. But this is really important when it comes to talking about Indigenous perspectives, that we're not talking, those Indigenous perspectives come from that place where they were given by the Creator, they're given by the community. Whereas Western, we look at the four walls, we look at academia as that place to give us the legitimacy, in a sense, if that's the, if that's what we're talking about here. So I think I've taken up my time, and I, just was how important it is to think about our own place and space when we are doing this work. A lot of people come from that Western mindset. So you already have certain biases about how you were educated, and may have certain biases that we all need to unlearn. We need to check our biases, but we also need to unlearn our biases as well. And that there's many, many ways to assessing and evaluating children, Indigenous kids. I was saying to our group, like, I would never have an evaluation sheet. I would just be able to see how that person, that student is doing just by observation. And then of course, you know, we all need to have our report cards and our, you know, certain things there, but I would be doing more things by observation. But those 4 R's are so important within our communities: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. So thank you for listening to me, and I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much. Oh, hi, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Sherry. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen and also apologize in advance because I am at home. I think probably people are dealing with the same issues. I have 2 kids going to school virtually. And so if they come in while I'm talking and disturb me, I apologize in advance. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay? Is it okay? Okay, my name is Pohai Kukea Schultz. I'm from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about kind of my perspective on the topic today. And I want to thank Sherry for kind of teeing us up for the discussion and explaining some of the differences in the ways that people view the world. And I'm hoping that as we move through this panel discussion, we can continue to keep this idea of honoring the worldviews of others in the forefront of our minds. You know, lately, we've been bombarded with images and news stories of civil unrest, protest, advocacy for Black lives. And I think that these images are just some of the ways that we can visually see the differences in worldviews that Sherry was talking about. So these images highlight stark differences, right? So we've got, on one side, we've got heavily armed National Guard troops in the Black Hills, so that some people refer to as Mount Rushmore, juxtaposed with Native people of that area who are protectors of that area performing a smudging ceremony and praying over these National Guard troops. Things have happened similarly here in Hawaii on Mauna Kea. So similarly outfitted National Guard troops and policy, and then arresting our elders. So the people who got arrested here were 60 years and older. And then finally, in protests around the world, we see people of all backgrounds and ages demanding an end to police brutality and the assertion that Black lives truly matter. So during this current time with a focus on Black lives and, you know, personally brown lives, as an Indigenous person, we often get the question, I often get the question, what can I do? You know, and it's a sincere question and I appreciate it. But to be completely honest, answering that question over and over again can be exhausting and overwhelming. So today, I'm in about 20 minutes, I'm gonna try to attempt to provide some answers to that question. And it's specific to the world of educational assessments. And of course, this isn't a comprehensive, you know, list or strategy, but I feel like we all need to do whatever we can to sort of chip away at the iceberg in whatever capacity we live in. So I wanted to just kind of start with an introduction of the work that I'm involved in. So it's difficult to give both the historical and political context of this assessment in 20 minutes, but I'm gonna do my best. So first, I'm a test developer. I'm the principal investigator for Ka'eo, the Kaipuni Assessment of Educational Outcomes, which is the Hawaiian language assessment for state and federal accountability. And Carrie Englert, who's speaking after me, is our lead psychometrician and an integral part of the work. So just kind of wanted to acknowledge her as well. Here in the state of Hawaii, the Hawaiian language is one of 2 official languages of the state. And this policy, along with others, has facilitated the establishment of a thriving Hawaiian language immersion program in our public school system, where the medium of instruction is the Hawaiian language. It's not taught as a world language or as a foreign language. It is the medium of instruction for all content areas. We also have a Board of Education policy that ensures that assessments for Hawaiian immersion students that are used for state and federal accountability align to the Hawaiian language immersion strategic priorities, which really means that the assessments must be created in the Hawaiian language. And I'm really glossing over all the policy, law, and community advocacy that made all of this happen. But here we are in 2020, and the students in our Hawaiian language immersion programs in the state of Hawaii in grades 3 through 8 take language arts, math, and science tests in the Hawaiian language for state and federal accountability. And to my knowledge, we're the first state to have native language assessments developed for this purpose. Here in our community, assessment has traditionally and historically been used to marginalize, mislabel, and disenfranchise our students, our Hawaiian students, and our Hawaiian language students in particular. And we're certainly not the only ones, right? Across the country that happens, and across the world that happens. And I won't get into the timeline here, but tests, basically over a 10 to 12 year period, our students, our Hawaiian speaking students were given English tests, tests developed in Hawaiian, but based on English language standards, which was a start. Poorly translated tests, English tests again, poorly translated tests again, until our community finally said enough. And the community, it's important to point out that the community was not anti-assessment. They just wanted a fair and valid test for their children. And so the question we started with, and that continues to be the foundation for the work, is how do we know that our children are learning Hawaiian and effectively learning through Hawaiian? And what we know for sure now, after the roller coaster that our kids have been on, is that the only way we can validly and reliably answer this question is by making sure that the assessment tool is in the Hawaiian language. So that's my very fast context building slide. And so if you need more information, you can contact me later. But anyway, I want to return back to this burning question that I mentioned in the beginning, which is, what can I do? So first step one, is I want to gather us together on some, proverbial common ground, some understandings that are based in the research that can help us to answer this question about what we can do. And the simplified version of this step is really just to expand our research base and utilize these theoretical understandings from researchers with diverse worldviews, as Sherry so eloquently explained, in whatever capacity you work in, right? Okay, so the first idea is that language is the marker of identity and has a vision of the past, present, and future. And so there are many scholars who have written about the importance of language for Native people, and this is not an exhaustive list. And the interesting thing to me is that even scientists now have started to acknowledge the value of Native language and knowledge as they attempt to deal with climate change, loss of biodiversity and habitats, et cetera. So what they're telling us is that Native language and knowledge is the key to unlocking solutions to some of our modern day problems. And in other words, revitalizing Native languages is good for everyone, right? It's not just good for us, but it's good for everyone. But for us, language is the key to the survival of our knowledge, our culture, and our worldview. And so I come from a place that acknowledges the importance of Native languages, but I think this idea can be applied to all students who come to an assessment whose first language is something other than English. And how fair, valid, and reliable are their results if they approach the test from a different worldview? And part of the what can I do approach is recognizing that there are test takers who are taking English tests with a language, identity, worldview, and culture that is out of alignment with English. And not only that, but that misalignment could affect how they do on these assessments. So recognizing the vital role that a student's language plays in how they see the world and their role in it is the first piece of this common ground that I'd like us to stand on. Okay. So the second is this idea that children have the right to be assessed in their language of instruction. And Sherry mentioned the UNDRIP. Thank you for teeing me up for talking about the UNDRIP. But the right to learn and speak and live our language was confirmed by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2008. But that work is being done in many other communities. So Maori in New Zealand, Sami in Norway, and many Native communities here in this country and around the world are focused on language revitalization efforts, both in school, in families, in assessment, all of it, right? And so tests that violate those rights of our children are not just inequitable and unfair, they're not valid. So I want to show you an example of what this looks like. Okay, so I show this slide a lot when I'm doing a presentation to folks who are not familiar with our assessment and who do not speak Hawaiian. So It doesn't really work with a Hawaiian speaking crowd. So if you speak Hawaiian, just don't say anything. Anyway, typically I ask them to tell me the correct answer and I give them a minute to do some calculations, but it's kind of hard to do on Zoom. So I'm just going to kind of talk you through it. Okay, so I'm assuming that most of you do not speak Hawaiian in the audience. So I am also assuming that you may be able to figure out what this question could possibly be asking based on context clues, like maybe area, perimeter, something about angles. But the truth is, you have no idea. You don't have a clue what this question is asking. And what's important about this exercise is for you to recognize the sudden stomach pain or nausea you may have developed, or cold sweat that you broke out in when you realized that you couldn't read this question. So now I'd like you to imagine if you were a third grader, 7, 8, 9 years old, who had to take a 50-item high-stakes test, and all the questions looked like this and were in a language that you did not speak or learn. And this is why we have to, and this is what our kids have gone through for years until now, until recently. And this is why we have to insist that our students are assessed in their language of instruction. So this is the second piece of that common ground that I hope that we can continue to gather on. And I've got one more. Okay. So this last idea is that for Native peoples, the concepts of accountability, reliability, and validity are based in our community and our culture. And what I'm asking here is that we expand our view of what validity, reliability, and accountability looks like. And Sherry talked a little bit about this earlier, about this accountability to our community. So I'm going to expand on that a little bit. But you know, when we talk about standardized tests and their technical quality, the most important aspects of that technical quality are validity and reliability, right? I mean, everybody, I think, here knows this. So psychometricians, many of whom are my friends, spend endless amounts of time after our administration analyzing validity and reliability data. And while I do recognize that these things are very important, I argue that expanding our view of what validity, reliability, and accountability looks like to include culture, language, and worldview is essential if we're going to develop an assessment with any cultural validity that's accountable to our communities. So we typically do not expect that test developers like myself are going to be accountable to the communities that take their assessments, but we should. And in fulfilling our relationships with the world around us, that includes our responsibilities to the people in our community. And again, this is part of this first step of standing on some common ground and expanding our understandings and the theoretical underpinnings that we use for these concepts of validity, reliability, and accountability. Okay, so now that we're all kind of standing in the same place, step 2 is it's time for us to think differently about the test development process. Okay, and I'm showing you this graphic. I'm sure that many folks on this call are extremely familiar with it because it's the standard process that test developers use when developing an assessment. I mean, it's not typical, it's actually the standard. It comes from the standards. However, there are a few things that are not standard about the test development process in my case. And it starts at the top of that circle. Our test is based on Kaiapuni student learning outcomes that are written in Hawaiian. And so this process, our development process, is dependent on prioritizing student learning outcomes that are aligned with the strategic goals of the Hawaiian Immersion Program. So that's one. The other atypical thing about this process is that you can see that the Hawaiian language immersion community is an integral part of each step of the process. So they're right in the middle of our circle and radiate out, right? And so the technical quality of the assessment as laid out by the standards is important. It's still there. It hasn't moved, it's still there. But equally important is the involvement of our community. And one other important thing to point out with our test development process is that we can still prioritize Hawaiian language and culture and our now expanded understandings of validity, reliability, and accountability, even in a process like this that was not developed with us in mind. So this ties back to the common ground that we all gathered around earlier. It's how we put these understandings of validity, reliability, and accountability into practice. So if we think about the title of today's session and how we create relevant and sustaining assessment systems, we cannot do it if we do not make changes at the foundational level of our assessments, right? For us, it's not about addressing it by adding a couple of questions about pineapples as part of your item development process. It's really about, it's not enough, right? It's really about making that cultural relevance an integral part of every step in the process. And for us, in the work that we do with the Hawaiian language assessment, This means o Hawaii ke kahua o ka nauau, or Hawaiian is the foundation of enlightenment. And more specifically, Hawaiian language, culture, knowledge, worldview is the foundation of this enlightenment. So you see this in the prioritization of the learning outcomes up top, and in the fact that the assessment is created in the Hawaiian language, but the project was also built on a philosophy of collectivity, and we really facilitate this process versus mandate it. So we hold this test development process lightly in our hands and really facilitate our community to do the work and to do the heavy lifting and to have input into every step of that process. So I think it bears mentioning too that these things and prioritizing cultural validity does not compete with technical quality. It is possible to do both. And in fact, Solano Flores and Nelson Barber have advocated that addressing cultural validity all the way through the test development process, as opposed to treating it as an afterthought, like developing a question about pineapples, as I mentioned earlier. But if we do that, if we address it throughout the entire process, we can mitigate the cultural bias issues that we grapple with after it's too late and the damage has already been done. Okay, so step 3 is recognize the transformative shifts that an assessment can have on a school and in a community. So if you work in a public school setting or have ever worked in a public school setting, I think Christina mentioned I used to be a teacher, a public school teacher. So you know the power of assessment results and the story that is told about the quote unquote success of a school or community based on those results. So if you are or have ever been a classroom teacher or a principal or anyone in, or anyone in kind of a staff in that school-based setting, you also know how standards and the assessment built on those standards drive instruction. And the truth is, it doesn't just drive instruction, what happens in the classroom, but it drives how resources are allocated across the district and state levels, in the classrooms, how time is allocated towards professional development, all of it, right? So these are just some of what you see on the screen are just some of the transformative shifts that have been facilitated by an assessment being created in Hawaiian. And it is a shift towards not only more linguistically relevant assessments, but more linguistically relevant curriculum and professional development, and also an increased cultural relevance in all of these areas with the support of the Hawaii DOE system at the system level, which is important, right? If you remember some of the common ground that we're standing on, then you know that transformative shifts are not just happening in relation to language, but also to culture, knowledge, worldview, and identity. And the student learning outcomes and the assessment are the drivers of these shifts. And so think about how the assessment in your community or state is driving how resources are being allocated towards curriculum development, professional development, and assessment development. Are we doing enough to make space at the table for diverse voices? Are children seeing themselves in the standards and the assessment that they are held to? And is this assessment contributing to transformative shifts or marginalization? So recognizing your role and the role of assessment in these transformative shifts is part of the answer to this question of what can I do? Part of it. Okay. So last step, almost done. Step 4 is, what about during a pandemic, right? So assessments have just been like flushed down the toilet this year, right? Because of the pandemic. And so what can we do when our assessment projects are turned on their heads? Well, I think we should be checking the health of our ecosystem, okay? So I wanna think about it in the same way that we think about the impacts that this pandemic has had on some of our ecosystems in our community. So actually a news report just came out over the weekend about this place that's on the screen now. This is Hanauma Bay. So you may have heard of it or visited it if you've ever come to Oahu. And this is a marine life conservation district, but counterintuitively, it's also a hotspot for visitors. So we have a state policy that's supposed to protect the diverse and endemic marine life here, but we also have thousands of people daily who impact this place in not so positive ways. And they're currently doing research, right? And I mentioned this news story that just came out over the weekend. But since the pandemic, since March, this place has been closed. And it's enabled scientists to establish a baseline of the health of the ecosystem to ensure that the Marine Conservation District policy lives into its promise. And they've just released sort of some initial findings, and surprise, surprise, the lack of human activity on the beach has improved the quality of the water, and also the behaviors of fish who are used to being scared away by humans, right? So their feeding patterns have changed. Anyway, so closing this place down since March has allowed the ecosystem to begin to recharge, reset, and get healthy. So now, while we're in a pandemic, maybe it's time for us to ask the same question. Is your ecosystem healthy? Is it as diverse as it could be? How Indigenous and diverse voices are given space here at this table is absolutely something concrete that can be done. And I do appreciate the opportunity to highlight some diverse voices like ours today, maybe. But much like reposting a Black Lives Matter quote on Instagram, this is just not enough. Just making space for a panel to highlight diverse voices is just simply not enough. And in this case, an addendum of the conference theme may be in order. How can we make measurement matter to the people who have historically been marginalized by assessment? To be completely honest, talking about making measurement matter when hundreds of thousands of people are putting their lives on the line to make sure that Black Lives Matter and that Brown Lives Matter feels kind of insignificant and incongruous. Like, what are we even doing here? But as we continue to think about this answer to the question of what can I do, I would like to humbly suggest, that we do more than a panel or two a year. Because we're a diverse group. My needs in revitalizing a language through assessment are really different from the needs of other communities of color across the country. And all of these voices should be heard. We shouldn't have to compete with each other for a space, you know, in a panel. And as we think about the health of our assessment and our ecosystem, we also need to think about how diverse voices in research can be more comprehensively integrated into our collective conversations about assessment. And I do want to thank NCME for facilitating this conversation on culturally responsive and sustaining assessment systems. But there is nothing sustainable about this if we do not invite more diverse voices to continually come to the table. So let's move beyond the title of a presentation or a theme of a conference to real, systemic, sustainable, and transformative shifts in our assessment community. It's how we move from the simple, what can I do, to what am I doing and will continue to do to amplify and empower traditional marginalized communities, either as a member of that community or as a critical ally. And there's plenty of room at my table. So truly, it's gonna take all of us. And so with that, I'd like to throw the ball to my favorite critical ally, Carrie Englert. And I'm like Sherry, I'm gonna be quiet now. Like Sherry said, I'm gonna be quiet now. Okay.
Thank you so much, Paul. Hi, I'm a little nervous to follow you. I don't know if everyone can hear me okay. And I want to echo what Paul said about the fact that I have kiddos at home and they might just burst in the door anytime during their learning day. I'm also going to try to share my screen. Sorry, it might just take me just a second. Okay, can everyone see that? Christina, we're good? Okay. Okay, my name is Carrie Englert, and I just want to be really transparent about who I am. I am a non-Indigenous psychometrician, but I have the honor to support several projects led by some very strong, wise Native women. I support Paul Hai's work, as she mentioned, on Ka'eo, and I also work with the Regional Education Lab in the Central Region, supporting projects in their Native American Research Alliance. So I want to talk a little bit today about my journey as an ally and what that looks like. I want to talk a little bit about one of the projects I work on and how we've tried to build validity evidence and specifically cultural validity in those projects, working with the community. So my goal for this session is to kind of give you an idea about what that looks like. And then at the end, I want to take a little time to talk about sort of what I've learned personally and professionally from supporting these projects, and trying to be an ally, as well as being really transparent about the mistakes that I've made. Because as Pohai mentioned, being an ally isn't just, posting hashtag Black Lives Matter. It's putting yourself, I believe, in these kind of spaces that may not be comfortable, or they may not be what you're typically used to as a measurement person, and we have to allow ourselves to make mistakes and to learn from them, and be humble in how we approach that work. So, all right. So I want to start out with this quote from Lee Cronbach. And it's a quote that I keep coming back to in my work because it really provides some focus. And he says that tests that impinge on the rights and life chances of individuals are inherently disputable. And I don't know about everyone on the call, but I think as a technical person, I love data, and I get in the weeds. I'm running analyses, and it can be intoxicating. And this quote kind of centers me and keeps me focused on why we're doing what we're doing. And I think, as Sherry and Pohai mentioned, it's really important to start thinking about assessments and building equity, because that's, and I think if you're on this call, that's what resonates with you too, trying to operate in that space of equity. So I want to talk first a little bit about a needs assessment survey that I'm working on, supporting North Dakota. And this work is for the Regional Education Lab. And just quickly, if you're not familiar with RELs, there's 10 across the country. And I support the REL in the Central Region that works in these 7 states. And the work that I do really is part of their Indian Ed Research Alliance, American Indian Research Alliance. And we kind of focus on needs assessments, and we focus on culturally responsive strategies. And I just wanted to note up front that the federal government likes us to use the term American Indian. I totally understand that that's problematic. And when I work with stakeholders in North Dakota, they will tell me and educate me on what they would like to be called. Oftentimes it's Native American or it's Lakota. So I try to include different terms when I'm talking with people. So you might see different terms throughout this presentation. Okay. So this is a typical needs assessment cycle, and it's one that North Dakota was following. And they invited us in to support their work in really understanding the needs of their Native American schools. First by developing a survey, administering the survey, analyzing the data, and then developing a plan. So I'm really going to focus mostly on the top box, because that's kind of where we were really thinking about building cultural validity into the content of that survey. And I want to mention too, the schools that we're really focusing on were both public schools and also schools that were part of the Bureau of Indian Ed. A little bit of background about the survey. North Dakota had been administering a survey, but they've reached out to REL Central to partner to create a revised survey. So it's really important for me to acknowledge that invitation and the honor to be able to support North Dakota. And really, we started to think about who was going to get the survey, how they would be constructed, and what that content would look like. And really key to some of this work is to think about what is validity and how do we approach that? And we started to look at some different definitions, and this is one from Ernie House that really resonates with me. It resonated with our team that was working on this project. And he says, I take validity to mean something like the worthiness of being recognized. And I really like this definition because I think it focused the project on what should be recognized and the worthiness of that through conversations with Native American community members, with Native American educators, and with the students themselves. What is worth being recognized in terms of the survey. The other definition that we looked at, and Pohai talked about Solano Flores and Nelson Barber earlier on, and it's really thinking about the social-cultural context and how that influences the instrument. So this definition was particularly important for the project because it's not just about people making sense of the items, it's also about how they respond to them. And the one thing that I think has come out of the survey that educators tell us is that as they take it, it's an opportunity for them to reflect on their practice and their work and how they can support Native students. So again, just really focusing and putting the community in the center and talking about the survey through a cultural lens. As Pohai mentioned, that was really important for Ka'eo too. Community is at the center. And we keep coming back and revisiting the content of the survey with stakeholders. And I think that's true for Ka'eo too, just kind of talking ongoingly with community about its meaning, the items, and how those items are being used, the results are being used. So for the survey, important to note that as we walk in this space, a lot of times as a non-Indigenous researcher, and non-Indigenous researchers have often made this mistake of focusing on what's wrong and how do we fix it. So really looking at the deficits. But for this survey, it was really important to take a broad sweep and look at the whole picture and really focusing on the strengths too and what the community wanted to relay. So participants gave us a lot of ideas about these big content areas they wanted to cover, and then also specific feedback on items and doing cognitive interviews. So it was a lengthy process. But just to give you a sense, this is sort of our development process, and it looks linear, but we keep kind of going back to the beginning. And thinking about those lighter blue boxes, those were all those opportunities to have those conversations with the community in different forums. So focus groups and presentations and feedback sessions. And the other thing that I was learning in these spaces is that it was really important to not just have one time point and one connection point with one group of stakeholders. It was important to really open up that door and make it inclusive to a lot of voices over time. And I just wanted to touch really quickly on some of the things that we learned, because it was really, it was powerful for me to hear these words. We learned a lot about priorities from educators working in Indian country. They told us they wanted the survey to address a lot of areas like recruitment and mental health and attendance, which are things you might hear about in any school. But really the details and the specific questions tended to be very different. They wanted the survey to talk about implementing Native culture and instruction, so that content. They wanted to understand how schools were reaching out and engaging tribal members and community members. And then we also talked, and this is very recently, we were starting to work on a student survey. So again, a huge honor that we were allowed to talk with students. And they had some really powerful statements and a very clear vision about what they wanted their schools to look like. I mean, they wanted to feel connected and they wanted to feel like part of that community, which I think all students want that. But they also had very clear ideas about what they wanted from their textbooks and from their courses. And they talked about things like the inadequacy of their textbooks and how those textbooks glorified manifest destiny, but didn't talk about the impact that those policies had on individual tribes, displacement, and the massacre of Native Americans. So it was just very powerful. So ultimately, this data is being used by North Dakota to implement supports that are culturally relevant and responsive to those communities, and thinking about ways to support mental health and to address things like historical trauma and engaging tribes and communities. And one last thing on this project I think is really powerful is how those surveys are being used to communicate out to the field. And one administrator reflected, and she said, the survey has multiple purposes. The questions can prompt people's thinking about their practices and the issues facing Native Americans, and send messages about what educators should be doing to help these students. So I thought that was really an important point, that, and I feel like when the community was involved, when they were engaged, we get some of these bigger outcomes. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, so I've talked about a couple of the projects, and I talked about Ka'eo, and I talked about the needs assessment. And these projects are being led, as I said, by two different amazing Indigenous women who just have this vision for students in their community. And so it's an honor to support them, and I try to enter those spaces with humility and to be a good resource, and to be a good ally. But it's a little unnerving because I make mistakes all the time, and just to try to check my ego at the door and to try to learn. And I've, again, worked with two women who are willing to help me on that journey to being a better ally. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background, because my worldview and culture really trip me up in ways that are kind of surprising. And Pohai has witnessed some of some of those mistakes. Pohai. All right, so I grew up in upstate New York in the 70s and 80s, and my mom was a scientist. She taught microbiology and chemistry at our local college. And here she is with her colleagues, and they're laughing, grading papers. And that's my vision, women as scientists. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I was not a great student in high school. In fact, I was doing really poorly in math in high school, and my mom was just disappointed. So she went to talk to my teacher, and I think he was trying to reassure her, like, don't, it's okay, it's going to be okay. And he said, don't worry, because girls can't do math, so it'll be fine. Girls can't do math anyway. So I think her head, like in The Exorcist, might have spun around on its axis. I don't know for sure. But she came home and she relayed the story to me. And so these two, like, women as scientists, but girls can't do math, it became part of my narrative, and it has influenced kind of how I view the world ever since. And so flash forward to 2016, and I'm supporting Pohai and the Ka'eo project. And I'm so excited. We have items, and we ran our field test, and we're looking at fairness. So naturally, the first thing I do is run my differential item functioning analyses. And I looked naturally, as I would, at gender differences. And I went to Pohai and I said, okay, well, these items got flagged for diff. And she went and she took them to her team, and they reviewed them, and she came back to me and said, so we're really not finding anything. And one of the reasons might be is that Hawaiian tends to be very gender neutral. So we don't have gender specific pronouns. We don't have gender specific first names. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. And we moved on with our analyses. And the next year, I did the same exact thing. So I went back to Paula and I said, oh, here are the items with diff. And she, again, very gently reminded me that Hawaiian is very different than English. And so I want to say I only did that twice, but I might have done it 3 times. Sorry, Pohai. But through that process, we started to think about, well, okay, a light bulb went off. Let's think about bias and fairness in a different way that's more relevant for this context. And this is a terrible picture, but this is the CAIO team, some of the CAIO team members who've worked on this project. And just reflecting on that example, it's viewing my measurement practice through my own cultural lens. And it's something that hinders my ability to kind of think outside the box. And I don't know if I have any answers, but I love this kind of idea of continually coming back to stepping outside of our comfort zone as non-Indigenous people and allowing those mistakes and to learn from those mistakes and to allow that to support professional growth. And again, in the past, when I was working on things like the Native American Needs Assessment Survey, I would have done a lot more sitting at my desk. I would have looked for research, I would have done analyses, worked with colleagues. I'm an introvert, so I'm really comfortable in that space. But CAIO and the Needs Assessment Survey have kind of pushed me out of that comfort zone. And also feeling just honored to work with colleagues who have been able to, I've been able to learn from, and they've been able to educate me on issues and context. So again, I'm not an expert on cultural validity or Indigenous assessment, but I want to pose some questions about how we think about our cultural mindsets. What does this mean for assessment? How do we accomplish this? And I certainly, as Solana Flores and Nelson Barber talk about, there aren't specific methods for ensuring cultural validity, but I have to feel, based on the projects that I've worked on, the foundation of that cultural validity begins with the wisdom, the expertise, and the input from the community members to really inform and improve that assessment process. So again, I don't know if I have any answers to those questions, but I don't know. I would love to hear from folks on the call if they have found great ways to think about culture and to engage stakeholders in ways to build assessments that kind of consider that. So I will turn it over.
Thank you. And that was a perfect segue to open it up to everyone in here. If you have questions, you can put them on the chat, or you can just unmute yourselves and feel free to talk. And let's have a nice conversation. If you have comments too, they are also welcome. So please. Well, seems like it's quite quiet. You guys did such a fantastic job that no one has any questions. Oh, there's one question here. To what were you able to attribute the div for a language that is gender neutral? I guess that's for you, Carrie. Or Pohai. In fact, you were both involved in that project. So either of you, do you have an idea where the div may come from if it's not gender specific language?
Yeah, I think some of those flags were just, and again, we have a very small sample size. And so I think a lot of it was kind of some noise, and we've really tried to explore that quite a bit because it was just really unclear where that was coming from. But we're going back and like rethinking those items, and we just finished, and boy, you can probably talk more about this, but we just finished a bias and sensitivity review and really looked more deeply at those items just from a cultural perspective too, which was really, I thought, really helpful in thinking about those items. I don't know, Pohai, if you have other.
I don't really have anything other to add. I think, I don't think we take the diff for granted necessarily. Like it comes up every year. And we look, me and my team, we look at it. We look at all of those items that have been flagged for diff. And we try to think about like, okay, is there anything, like, is there anything gender specific about this question? And 99% of the time there's not. So I think this item review that we just did of all of our operational items, it was kind of a extensive bias and sensitivity review. Is we're still analyzing that data, but I think is going to give us additional information, not maybe about these specific questions, that have been flagged for diff, but just in general, if there are gender biases that we're missing in sort of our item review. So yeah, I think that's the only thing I had to add about that.
Thank you so much.
And I was just going to say one more thing about diff, because I love it so much. The other, and as Paul had mentioned, we certainly keep thinking about gender diff, and we think about SES and other factors. And one of the other things that we're really starting to think about is surveying the students as part of the assessment process to get a sense of how language might impact some of the diff results that we're seeing, and to think about if there's certain like words that are causing problems and things like that. So we're kind of trying to explore different options for running diff analyses.
Very interesting, thank you. We got another question from David Su. There was some discussion about validity and citations from Western perspective. I think the three of you have touched on that at some point or another. The question is, how might validity be described from an Indigenous perspective?
I don't want to, okay, I'm just going to talk. Okay, sorry.
Go for it.
Anybody else? I'm going to defer.
I'll go too.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we talked, as we talked about like cultural validity and what that looks like, sort of this expanded view of what validity can look like from Indigenous people. I think it's tied to our communities. It's tied to accountability to our communities. I talked a little bit about, Sean Wilson talks about relational accountability, and what that is really about that you're just, as an Indigenous researcher, that was the context of his work, but as an Indigenous assessment person, or whatever I'm calling myself, that accountability to community is key, right? So there are obvious cultural aspects of an assessment that have to be present, right? Like an assessment based on student learning outcomes that are based in culture, right? Or that are written in the Hawaiian language in my context, right? But I think there's a large portion of validity from an Indigenous perspective that really is about your accountability to your community. So I'm a test developer, I mentioned that at the beginning, right? And it's taken me a little while to sort of like be able to say that without going, oh, I'm a test developer, because I know what people think. I mean, my community thinks when you say test developer, right? But the level of accountability that I am held to as a test developer is not normal, but it should be, right? So I present at quarterly principals meetings. So I get up in front of the room and I give principals updates, and I sit in the hot seat while they ask me questions, right? So the principals of Hawaiian immersion schools. I don't know if that really happens typically. I also go to community advisory meetings every quarter. So I go to these community meetings, they're held across the state, and it's expected that I show up. If I don't show up, I can't show my face around town because I'll get called out on it, right? So this idea that everything has to be transparent, and also that we have to nurture these relationships with our communities. I mean, I don't have I don't know if I have an all-encompassing definition, but I do know what it is that I've experienced at what we do. And so I think the two important parts are like basing our assessment on student learning outcomes that are based in our culture and language, and then the community accountability aspect. So I'm going to be quiet so Sherry can add to that too.
I was just going to just mention you know, historically research that has been undertaken since colonization on Indigenous lands and Indigenous people have been so over, you know, we're one of the most researched people in Canada. But in the past, it's always been without us. People come into communities and do research on us without us. So in Canada, we have this term right now called nothing for us without us, making sure that we are in the room, that we are having those discussions, as well as right from the very beginning of creating the questions, creating the survey, creating the assessment, what that looks like. Because when we do have language learners who do have, are very, very well versed in their language, just having gender norms is problematic as well. But, you know, the other thing too is that, you know, this whole research done for us without us being there, it also eradicates and destroys a lot of learning that our ancestors have had since time immemorial. So if we've survived here for years and years and years, with, you know, with just the environment and people having a different viewpoint, those are problems that are, you know, part of the eradication and marginalization of Indigenous peoples, and our right to self-determination, right? We have the right to self-determination. It's all part of the UNDRIP as well. And that, you know, we need to go through this development of inappropriate, misguided policies as well, and to be more critically minded and to be equitable of where those biases come from, and that if they're misguided in their policies, because we all have policies in where we work, who are those policies made for? Who's excluding? Who do we hire? Who gets promoted? Those kinds of things. So, you know, it also, having those mindsets also play part in the research into Indigenous communities.
Thanks, Sharon. So we have a comment on the chat that mentions that explaining cultural differences as an innate characteristic differences needs to be rethought completely. It's a comment, not really a question. Basically, it gives example, the notion of male being better than females in math is not valid when you go beyond the Western culture. Here in Saudi Arabia, females outperform male in math and science. So I really appreciate that perspective from that other culture that it's probably not Western, and how we talk about differences. I agree, it's very important, but I don't want to hijack what you just said. I cannot express it better in any absolute way. So. Any final thoughts or comments any of you would like to share?
I think one thing that we all need to, that I'm always reminded by my elders, is that we are our own individual. We only have our own experiences that we come with. But when we are in a society that comes from all over the place, we have to look at the cultural shifts and the cultural mindsets from where a lot of communities come from. In Canada, you know, if everybody in Canada, if you're not an Indigenous person, everybody in Canada is an immigrant, just like the States, right? Like if you're not a Native American person, you're an immigrant, that you came to Canada or you came to the United States for a different life, a better life. But knowing the importance of whose land you're on, and that's how important these land acknowledgements are in Canada, knowing the importance of the land that you're on also situates yourself as a new Canadian. Maybe you've been here for many generations, but you still came here from somewhere else. We have nowhere else to go. If I want to go and learn my language, I have to go home, or I have to start a language camp. In Hawaii, they're so lucky that they have the Hawaiian language as second language. Here in Canada, we have French and English. Not one of our Indigenous languages are are recognized. But yeah, we have a language commissioner and we have all these things. So I think it's really important as wherever you come from, that you situate yourself on the land that you're on, that you had certain privileges of coming, of being here, the privileges that you have now. I'm also a homeowner, so I have the privilege of owning my own home. My mom never had the privilege of owning her own home because of policies that were in place for Indigenous women. And I think really having those, understanding our own biases and the places of where we come from and the land of our own ancestors, right, really broadens that horizon, really gives more breadth into any sort of work that you're doing, because we know that we're all individuals and not one of us have the same thought, right? Never should we be thinking that, you know, my idea is better than somebody else's. It's making sure that everybody has room at the table.
100% with you, Sherry. Well, if there's nothing else, I think we can just call it a day or an afternoon or a session. Thank you all so much for participating. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to our panelists, and hope to keep the conversation going outside of this setting. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.